Hunter-gatherer prehistory. The hunter-gatherer stage of human history, which started around 2.5 million years ago, was like the ultimate nature-based adventure. Imagine your daily routine of finding food by foraging wild plants and hunting animals. There were no supermarkets, no Uber Eats, just pure wildness, survival skills, and the great outdoors. Back then, people lived in small, mobile groups, often traveling long distances for food. There were no jobs other than hunting animals and gathering edible food. If you had the physical tools of LeBron James, you'd be great at chasing and killing animals, but if you could barely hurt a fly and had no talent for killing, you'd be a gatherer, which was mostly a woman's job. The lifestyle required teamwork and an in-depth knowledge of the environment. It takes over a handful of men to take down a woolly mammoth. You'd also have to know which fruits, nuts, and vegetables are safe to eat. More than a few gatherers probably sacrificed their lives to test out whether a certain type of berry was poisonous. Fire was a game changer. It was the biggest invention of that time, like smartphones are the biggest inventions of this modern period. Knowing how to make fire meant warmth, protection, and the ability to cook food. There were no work hours. You didn't have to clock in at 9 and leave at 5 because finding food was a full-time job. But the good news was that there were no bosses, cubicles, or strict supervisors micromanaging your every move. It was a socially centered lifestyle focused on sharing food and knowledge instead of pulling people down to climb the caveman corporate ladder. Toolmaker, Stone Age. Imagine trying to build a house or chopping vegetables with your bare hands. After years of doing this, you'd probably come out with hands of stone, but doing everything barehanded probably isn't the best way to build a civilization. That's when our ancestors started a new line of work by becoming toolmakers. When early humans realized they could smash rocks, they had a light bulb moment, thinking that they could use these pieces and make them sharp enough. This was basically the stage of work where humans were figuring out how to use their surroundings to make life a little easier. Rocks were the most common materials they could find because they were practically everywhere. They realized that sharp stones could cut meat and break nuts open. This was a huge deal because they could do things faster and more efficiently. Think of it as the Stone Age version of upgrading from a dull butter knife to a shiny new chef's knife. Over time, their tool-making skills improved. Instead of smashing rocks and hoping for the best, they shaped them into specific tools. It went from, let's just break it and see what happens, to, I got the right tool just for that. There were hand axes, scrapers, and eventually spear points. It's like they went from smashing things as hard as they could using rocks to crafting custom tools that could solve specific problems. As these early toolmakers roamed around, they learned how to use other materials. Bones and sticks came in handy as handles for their tools, making life easier because nobody wants to be known as the caveman who tried to chop wood with a bone. With better tools, they could hunt larger animals and process food more efficiently. The toolmaker stage was basically the ultimate DIY era of human history because you'd no longer go oonga boonga by pounding things with rocks. Instead, thanks to your local toolmaker, you had actual tools that could be used for farming, hunting, and crafting. Agricultural Revolution, 10,000 BCE. During the hunter-gatherer period, you'd move from one place to another, depending on whether or not enough plants and animals were available in an area. That means you didn't have time to unpack your luggage before you had to move to another zip code. But they decided to stay put when early humans got tired of moving and were looking to settle down to start a nice caveman family in a stable home. Someone must have gotten fed up with a nomadic lifestyle and said, hey, why don't we just grow our food? That's how the agricultural revolution came about. This time, instead of hunting and gathering, people became full-time farmers, planting seeds and growing crops in one spot. While it took a while for crops to grow, it was still better than chasing your food in the middle of the forest and risking getting eaten by a saber-toothed tiger stalking you from the shadows. You could simply domesticate plants, like wheat, barley, and rice, in the comforts of their lands without risking life and limb for your daily meals. People also started domesticating animals, like cows, sheep, and goats, which provided a ready supply of milk and meat in their backyards. By simply waiting for their crops and animals to grow, people had more spare time to build homes, craft tools, and develop early forms of civilization. Caveman Bob could finally pursue his passion for cave painting now that he no longer had to spend the entire day hunting. Pottery Neolithic Age. You've done your job as a prehistoric farmer, sowing seeds and harvesting crops, but you realize you may have harvested more than you can eat for a day, as if you placed too many vegetables in your shopping cart and don't have a refrigerator at home. So you're wondering what to do with your time and extra supply supplies. That's when you decide to make stuff instead of relying on what Mother Nature had lying around the forest. People started becoming potters and craftsmen during the Neolithic Age. They realized that they could mold clay and use different materials to craft pots, bowls, and jars that changed the course of human history. This is what you'd call a potential breakthrough. Now, pots were not just decorative pieces for caves and ancient homes. Instead, they were the Tupperware of the ancient world because they were handy for storing food, water, and grains. Imagine ancient humans discovering the power of a good clay bowl. It was revolutionary because they could now store supplies in these containers without worrying about long winters. They also discovered how handy bowls were for drinking soup and eating rice. You probably can't imagine life eating porridge from a flat piece of rock. Potters became the biggest stars of this time in human history because they had the training and skills no one else had. These crafty clay wranglers were shaping mud into masterpieces, all without the luxury of a spinning wheel. They molded their creations by hand, dried them out, and baked them in a fire, turning soft clay into something more durable and waterproof than your hydro flask. The result was durable, waterproof, and more practical than juggling grain in your bare hands. Builder, ancient Mesopotamia. Being a builder in ancient Mesopotamia, one of the cradles of civilization, was kind of a big deal. The world was starting to realize that stones and bricks were the pillars of homes and cities, so builders were essentially as important as modern engineers, who drew up plans and ensured that a huff and puff from the big bad wolf wouldn't topple houses down. But the difference was that a builder's toolkit didn't include modern marvels like cranes and power tools. Instead, they had to rely on mud, straw, and sheer muscle power. There was no need for an ancient gym membership when you were a builder because rocks and bricks were your dumbbells. The Mesopotamians were pioneers of building things, using large bricks the world had never seen before. Picture a supersized Lego set, but instead of colorful plastic, you've got bricks made from mud. These bricks were the backbone of their ancient temples, city walks, and homes. And the only guys who knew how to make and use them were the Mesopotamian builders. But it wasn't just about slapping some bricks together. Builders had to figure out architecture fundamentals long before they had those fancy blue papers for their blueprints. They had to learn how to stack walls so they didn't collapse. So in many ways, these Mesopotamian builders were the original construction influencers. Builders had a special place in society because the ancient Mesopotamians knew they wouldn't have those fancy temples and buildings without them. After all, they literally laid the foundations for society. Metallurgy, Bronze Age. Our ancestors were literal rock stars for thousands of years because they relied almost everything on rocks, including their tools and houses. They probably thought there wasn't any material that could match the strength of a good old rock until around 3300 BCC, when someone had the brilliant idea to level up from rock to metal. That's when they discovered metal, specifically bronze, starting a new line of work called metallurgy. It's basically the science of working with metals, which started with the discovery of copper. Metallurgists were your ancient blacksmiths, but metallurgy was discovered in a huge oops moment when these ancient people were using rocks for their campfires. Imagine their surprise when they went to roast marshmallows and instead found a pool of shiny new metal. The metal that seeped out made them realize that these rocks had been hiding something valuable all along. Eventually, they learned to heat copper ore in a furnace. This process, called smelting, separates the metal from the rock, kind of like trying to get the good candy out of a really tough wrapper. Then they'd mix it with tin, making bronze, which is easier to shape than rock. This was a game changer because bronze is stronger and more durable than rocks. Imagine upgrading from an axe to a chainsaw. Ancient humans felt that way when they learned that bronze tools were stronger. This is why metallurgy was one of the most important lines of work during this era in human history. Metallurgists crafted sharper weapons, sturdier tools, and artistic objects, leading to advancements in agriculture, warfare, and craftsmanship, all because of this new technology. Suddenly, everyone wanted in on the bronze action, and trade routes expanded faster than the New York subway filling up during rush hour. Scribe, ancient Egypt. Imagine living in ancient Egypt, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient world. Now, forget about computers, phones, and notepads for a moment. In this world, if you wanted to keep track of anything important, like grain storage, taxes, or even royal decrees, you needed someone special to write it all down. It was like trying to organize your life before smartphones. That's when scribes became a hot commodity as human secretaries. Scribes were basically the the ultimate office nerds of the ancient world because they were the equivalent of today's data managers, journalists, and accountants all rolled into one. They held a really prestigious position in society because they mastered the art of hieroglyphics. You need to understand that not everyone in ancient times could write. Only the smartest people in ancient Egypt learned how to write, because learning hieroglyphics was like learning how to code in today's modern world. But being a scribe wasn't just about jotting down grocery lists for pharaohs. These guys recorded everything from historical events to religious texts and administrative records. They worked for everyone, from priests to merchants, helping manage the complex system of Egyptian bureaucracy. Imagine being the only person in your village who could read and write. You'd basically be one of the most powerful people in town. Being a scribe also exempted you from physical labor. So while everyone else was sweating under the hot sun to build the pyramids, you got to sit in the shade and write in peace because you were the brains behind ancient Egypt's organization. Without scribes, the pharaoh's grand plans might have just floated away like desert sand. Slave labor in ancient civilizations, 2000 BCE through 400 CE. If you hate your job now because you feel overworked while living paycheck to paycheck, your life is a million times better than being a slave in ancient times. Being a slave wasn't quite the same as your typical 9-to-5 job because it was more like an all-day, all-night situation. The worst part was that you weren't paid and had no vacation days. Across ancient societies, slavery was a widespread practice, and slaves were often the engine that powered the growth of major civilizations, kind of like unpaid interns. Slaves were typically prisoners of war, criminals, or those in debt. If you were a slave, you'd be forced to perform hard labor, such as constructing canals, and monumental buildings like the pyramid. Or if you had a nicer master, you'd probably be doing lighter work, such as mining, farming, and domestic jobs. Some in ancient Greece were even teachers and craftsmen. In Rome, if you were a particularly muscular and strong slave, your master might even throw you into gladiatorial fights. While there was a big chance of getting unalived in the arena, the grand prize was winning your freedom. But while some slaves worked their way up the ladder to impress their masters and earn their freedom, others continued working day and night until their death. Their masters didn't exactly believe in the concept of work-life balance, making it clear that a slave's life revolved only around work. Despite being inhumane, slave labor helped these ancient civilizations build monumental achievements. Still, it was the worst career path for anyone. That's why no one during the ancient eras ever said, "When I grow up, I want to be a slave like my dad." Merchant, Classical Era. The original Jeff Bezos started during the Classical Era, when merchants became more common in mainstream society. That was when trade networks began to boom, connecting civilizations in ways that forever changed how people lived, worked, and did business. Imagine a bustling market with goods from distant lands, spices, silks, and exotic animals on display. This was the shopping mall of your great-great-great-great ancestors. But instead of buying sneakers and iPhones, they traded goods they got from faraway places like Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. If you were a merchant, you weren't just selling goods, but also connecting cultures, because no one would ever think that animals like lions existed if you didn't import them from Africa to Europe. Being a merchant also allowed regular people to rise from humble beginnings to a respected post in society. Even if you weren't born into a noble house, you could still make a name for yourself by working your way up as a merchant, earning fame and fortune through your exotic goods. It's like how Mark Zuckerberg started as a regular college student before becoming a billionaire overnight. That was why merchants were like the middle children of society. They weren't as spoiled as the noble youngest sibling. Their chores weren't as heavy as the eldest sibling, the peasants. The rise of the merchant class paved the way for a growing economy, allowing the free flowing of goods and riches throughout society. This world wouldn't have been as progressive if people hadn't discovered they could make a living selling stuff. Soldier, Roman Empire. Let's say you lived during the height of the Roman Empire, when Rome was the peak of human civilization because of its military might. The Roman Empire's focus on expanding its territory through military campaigns made it clear that the most prestigious job for a common person was to become a soldier. Think of it as the equivalent of being an NFL or NBA player today. You get to show off your physical might while also making a good living. Being a Roman Empire's military member was more than just swinging a sword. Donating that iconic legionnaire armor took discipline, training, and knowledge. Rome had a well-oiled military machine that was the envy of the ancient world. Every kingdom and nation in the world didn't want to be on Rome's bad side, because that would mean seeing legions of soldiers knocking on their gates the next morning. But there's a reason only the best could serve the Roman military, and why being a soldier gave you prestige, respect, and maybe a few Roman women ready to take your armor off. You're trained rigorously. It's like a boot camp, with more yelling in Latin, and where discipline is the name of the game. You needed to be great at handling swords, spears, and shields, and memorize countless formations. Being a soldier also means having skills as a builder, because Rome expanded its territories quickly by hitting two birds with one stone. Legions of soldiers not only took over enemy territories, but also constructed roads and bridges back to Rome. So one day you might be charging into battle, and the next you're hauling rocks to build some infrastructure. That's why Roman soldiers were paid a good wage in silver, and were given a lot of land after 25 years of serving Rome. If you think about it, this is probably where the concept of retirement pension comes from. And in this economy, you'd probably prefer getting real estate for your retirement. Monks and scholars, Middle Ages. If you think about the Middle Ages, you'd likely imagine castles, knights, and maybe dragons. But while it may have been cool to work as a knight slaying fictional overgrown lizards, being a monk or a scholar was like being the unsung hero of the medieval period. Monks and scholars may have been your medieval geeks, but they were the source of intellectual wisdom and scientific knowledge when people were more interested in winning gold and glory in wars. They were writing manuscripts and books while preserving ancient texts that became the foundation of today's history classes. Keeping knowledge alive was an important job during a time when literacy was as rare as finding a unicorn. These guys were also expanding discussions about God and philosophy. That was why monasteries were the centers of education. Monks and scholars were the educators of their time, while muscle-bound and armor-clad knights were busy going to war and fighting people with different religious beliefs. Being a monk meant sharing religious knowledge and discussing scholarly topics, including science and literature. Kings always had a reliable scholar acting as their voice of reason. Looking at most universities today, you'll notice they have religious foundations. That's because they can trace their roots to monasteries that were eventually turned into schools and colleges designed to teach the next generation. While castles were sharpening swords and strengthening muscles, monasteries were sharpening intellects and strengthening minds. Explorer. Age of Exploration. You probably travel for vacation and leisure, but during the Age of Exploration, traveling the world meant boldly going to places no man had gone before. That means braving rough seas, blindly sailing to the ends of the world, and angering a few local tribes in isolated islands. This was the adventurous life of an explorer. Imagine it's the 15th century and Europe is buzzing with excitement because the Renaissance sparked a thirst for knowledge. People are more interested in exploring the world. It's like everyone got bit by the wanderlust bug. That was when guys like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan started sailing the world, discovering new lands no one thought existed. They had to redraw the world map 1,000 times because people found new places weekly. The most prominent discovery was the Americas, which Columbus accidentally stumbled into after thinking there was a shortcut to India by sailing west. Because of the riches brought home by explorers and the properties they got from happy kings who now had new lands to conquer, being an explorer was the dream of every young man who didn't want to get stuck in Europe. Explorers returned home filthy rich and opened new trade routes while bringing back gold, crops, and spices. Imagine how bland your food would be without tomatoes and peppers. Europeans basically explored the ends of the world because they couldn't handle eating wheat all day, every day. Industrial worker, Industrial Revolution. It's the 19th century and you're a farm boy planting corn on your farm. Life seems simple and easy, but you dream of something bigger because you want to be a factory worker in a big city where the air is thick with progress and possibly coal dust. It's worth it because everyone knows that factory work is so much more glamorous than breathing fresh air and eating fresh food on a farm. The world was growing and changing faster than a steam-powered ship at that time. People were moving from farms to cities because there were more job opportunities in factories. You could thank the Industrial Revolution for bringing new inventions and innovations that transformed the world. But life in the big city wasn't a walk in the park, but was more like a jog through Jurassic Park because of how dangerous the job was. Factory workers had to work 12 to 16 hours a day, and with all those moving parts and clanking machines, it was less take your child to work day and more lose a limb at work day. Accidents were common because safety regulations were as rare as Charizard Pokemon cards. Still, factory workers were the backbone of the rise of industrial society, producing everything from textiles to iron and coal. Even though pay was low, it was the only work most people who weren't educated or particularly skilled in any craft could do. Even children had literal tough upbringings when they were forced to work alongside adults in factories. Forget child's play because it was more like child's grind. Despite the tough and dangerous work setup, factory workers were why we have better labor laws today. They were the catalysts for the rise of labor unions, fighting for fair pay, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. If it weren't for factory workers, you'd probably still be working a tough 9-to-9 job with no medical coverage, vacation leaves, or lunch breaks. Telegraph operator, 19th century. Thanks to smartphones, you can easily FaceTime your friend from halfway across the world in India in just a few seconds. But 200 years ago, the introduction of the telegraph changed the communication world because people no longer had to wait months to receive a message that said, "Seen." At the heart of this new communication system was the telegraph operator, one of the most important people during the 19th century. So think of the telegraph as the great-great-grandparent of the telephone. Instead of letting you chat in real time, it sent messages using a series of dots and dashes over long wires. And in the middle of all that, you had telegraph operators working their magic. One operator would tap out those dots and dashes on their end, while the operator on the other side would decode them into an actual message. It was like a really early version of texting. Essentially, these operators were the human equivalent of the send and receive buttons we use daily. This was a very important job because the telegraph was the gold standard of communication. People didn't even think talking to someone far away in real time was possible during a time when they had to use pigeons to send messages. That's why telegraph operators were angels sent from the future. And if you were a telegraph operator, you had to be skilled, fast, and accurate. Imagine sending an "I love you" message from a love-smitten guy to his girlfriend halfway across the country, only for you to make a mistake by sending "I hate you." If breaking up through text is already bad enough, it's even worse when it happens through a telegraph, and you'll be the catalyst of this accidental breakup. But telegraph operators needed to be trustworthy gatekeepers of information. They had to keep things to themselves, especially when sending and receiving confidential information. You wouldn't want to send your bank details through telegraph if the operator wasn't trustworthy enough to use this information and steal all your hard-earned money. Assembly line worker, early 20th century. Imagine a huge buffet where every section has a cook who needs to focus on his specialty. The Chinese section has chefs flipping fried rice on their woks. Meanwhile, there's a special meat section where you can order your steak cooked based on your personal preferences. This makes the buffet more efficient. Now, instead of food, think of different sections of a factory working on specific parts. That's the assembly line in action. Before the early 20th century, cars and other mechanical stuff were crafted by skilled workers, often one at a time. It was slow and expensive. That's why only the rich could afford cars, all while the peasants were walking or riding horse-drawn carriages. Imagine trying to impress a date with your horse-drawn carriage while your buddy rolls up in a shiny new Model T. But Henry Ford's introduction of the assembly line changed the game, revolutionizing the automotive industry and the entire economy. It's kind of like a human conveyor belt where workers stand at specific stations, each producing only one part and doing the same task repetitively for 8 to 10 hours a day. The growth of this industry allowed the assembly line worker to become the mainstream job of your everyday Joe. Sure, the job may have been repetitive, but the assembly line gave lots of people work because the car industry started booming, allowing more people to buy affordable cars. Assembly line workers were paid double what most other industries were getting. Sure, it wasn't much, but at least you'd live a better life than your neighbors working in steel and coal factories. You could even afford the same thing you were making, a Ford car. Ironically, you were putting together the same vehicle that got you to work daily. Post-war suburbanization and service work, 1950s. Thanks to Henry Ford and World War II, people during the early 1900s were working in manufacturing, building stuff that powered the war effort, such as cars, planes, and tanks. But while everyone celebrated the end of the war, some people were like, wait, what about our jobs? That's when people started moving out of cities and into suburbs, where their lifestyle and work changed. So during the 1950s, there was a huge boom in service work, jobs that involved helping people instead of making things. You're looking at jobs like waiters, salespeople, doctors, nurses, and bank tellers. Those soldiers who were frying enemies with grenades were now frying chicken at the local KFC. The focus was on serving the people within the country instead of getting shipped off to Europe to fight another war because no one wanted to pack their bags for that one. Suburbanization meant people needed more services. Those neat suburbs needed things like schools, hospitals, and grocery stores because no one wanted to drive an hour into the city just to buy a carton of milk. The rise of the family car and highways made it easier for people to live farther from where they worked, creating a demand for businesses that catered to these new family structures. Nothing says family bonding than driving to a nearby fast food joint where you see many people working service jobs. Women, too, started entering the workforce in greater numbers, often in these service-oriented jobs. So they weren't just making sandwiches at home, but were also making them in restaurants. While many were expected to care for their homes and families, a growing number found work as secretaries, teachers, or nurses. This changed the traditional family dynamic because women were no longer just staying at home, but were also getting almost equal pay. Computerization and the tech industry, late 20th century. During the 1960s, computers were as rare as Bigfoot because you could hardly see any of these things except in large rooms. The first computers were so big that you could probably use them for a yo mama joke. However, as technology advanced, they became smaller and more compact. By the 90s, those big machines were popping up in just about every home. Personal computers were becoming a regular sight in offices and living rooms alike. This means that the PC was not just for scientists and tech nerds, but also for everyday people who wanted to type documents, play games, send emails, or express their frustrated artistic side in the Paint app. Basically, people realized they could make computers do the digital heavy lifting. The rise of computers and the booming of the internet turned the tech world into a booming industry, with companies like Google, Amazon, and Apple dominating the business world and opening up computer and tech-related jobs for the everyday person. Suddenly, your job wasn't just about flipping burgers or filing endless paperwork. Now you could be flipping bits and filing bugs. Your role could involve creating computer programs, managing cybersecurity, or ensuring the internet runs smoothly. Even regular non-tech companies threw out the old filing cabinet, which had previously been stuffed with papers like a squirrel hoarding acorns. They swapped out typewriters and all those dusty shelves of papers for computers on every desk. They figured out that these machines were way more convenient, versatile, and efficient. You could even search for a document without having to play hide and seek with thousands of files in a room of cabinets. Globalization and outsourcing, late 20th century through 21st century. Imagine you were a company in the US in the 1990s, when most of your business had to happen close to home. You were probably sipping your coffee, adjusting your beeper, and thinking you'd made it. But then technology comes along, and suddenly it feels like the world discovered teleportation for work. Now, instead of worrying about paying local workers who want things like a livable wage and benefits, you could move your business to another country and still operate it smoothly. Businesses realized they could save more money by sending jobs in places with a lot more people and lower costs of living. That's why they started outsourcing jobs to countries where labor was much cheaper. It was as if you found out there was a 2-for-1 sale for labor in Asia. The idea was to send jobs like manufacturing, customer service, and tech support to other countries because they didn't need to be anywhere close to headquarters to operate. That guy who told you to unplug and plug back in your router to fix your internet problems could be based in Bangladesh for all you know, but it doesn't matter where he's from as long as he speaks good English and fixes your tech issues. Meanwhile, that American branded phone you're using isn't as American as you think because its parts were made in the East. The saying, God made the world and the rest is made in China, is true because outsourcing manufacturing in China is much more cost efficient because of the cheaper labor and lower factory costs. The rise of the gig economy, 21st century. The gig economy is the very definition of every day we're hustling, because gone are the days when people had to stick with the usual morning clock-ins and afternoon clock-outs. Now you have independent contractors, side hustlers, and part-time jobbers working hard without limiting themselves to the usual office desk jobs. Being a worker in a gig economy is like being a juggler at a circus, except instead of juggling balls, you're juggling different jobs. You may be working as a cab driver, but you're also saving time by working as a call center agent while on the road. Basically, you're piecing together a living from various short-term tasks or gigs that may not be as glamorous as other jobs, but at least they pay the bills. The big driver of this change was the 2008 financial crisis, when people lost their jobs so fast that even their coffee hadn't finished brewing. In response, many turned to the gig economy, realizing that as long as they had a laptop and a Wi-Fi signal stronger than their morning coffee, they could do just about anything, from selling houses to starting podcasts about selling houses. Employers also like hiring these workers because it means not providing benefits, like health insurance, vacation leaves, and the ever-problematic union strike. strikes. So it's a win-win situation for both sides, even though there's no job security, like a relationship where the girl loves you but likes to keep things casual. Freelancing, 21st century. Being a freelancer means you're in a massive buffet of work opportunities that allow you to pick and choose what you want to do. You're not letting the traditional 9-to-5 setup tie you down to your chosen means of living, because as long as you have internet and a laptop that doesn't sound like it's running on borrowed time, you can do anything, anywhere, anytime. Imagine sitting in your living room in California and writing a blog for a company in Tokyo. Or you can be vacationing in a cafe in Paris while designing a logo for a small business in New York. That's what it means to be a freelancer. The main appeal of this line of work is flexibility. If you're a freelancer, you decide your schedule, location, and clients. That freedom means you can take on projects that align with your passions or skill sets. You don't have to be a lawyer just because your dad and his father before him were lawyers. Now you can break free from the ancient family tradition of legal briefs and instead pursue your true calling, streaming video games while passionately reviewing restaurants. There's also a good chance to earn more than the traditional worker because you can juggle multiple clients simultaneously. The problem is that freelancers don't have the same job stability. One day you're earning good money editing videos for a famous YouTube personality. The next day you lose your job because that guy got canceled for racist comments. And you don't even get to edit the monetized apology video. Remote work and telecommuting. 21st century. Welcome to the 21st century, where your commute might just be a short walk from your bed to your laptop. This stage of work took off thanks to the internet, which turned traditional office life on its head. Instead of fighting traffic, hunting for parking, or cramming into a subway car, you could now stay home, sip coffee in your pajamas, and attend meetings via video calls. The shift towards remote work started picking up steam in the early 2000s with the development of faster internet, cloud-based tools, and video conferencing. For companies, it was a win-win. They could reduce office space and attract talent from a broader geographic pool. It can sometimes look awkward when your cat starts walking on your keyboard during a meeting, but there was more flexibility and balance in your life. Of course, not everyone loved this setup. Some people missed the water cooler chats, or the, hey, let's grab a drink after work later moments. Meanwhile, bosses who love micromanaging aren't sure whether their employees wear sweatpants or are in business attire during conferences. That's why remote work wasn't the most popular setup during the early 2000s. Then came the big push in 2020 when the pandemic forced many companies to fully embrace remote work almost overnight. It was like the universe said, "Surprise, your office is now the couch." What was considered an experiment quickly turned into the new norm for millions. Companies and employees alike realized they could work just as productively in their living rooms as they can in an office setup. Post-pandemic, many companies still follow remote work setups or hybrid models that seem to work for many industries because they see the benefits of flexibility and work-life balance. What was supposed to be a passing trend may have become the modern model for work life. The future may be less work cubicles and more, "I'm sorry, but you're on mute" moments. We hope that we're not on mute right now because we'd like you to subscribe to our channel. Thank you, and let's keep going. AI trainer, future. Imagine yourself working as a fitness trainer in a gym. Your job is to push people into the best shape of their lives by telling them what to do and avoid. You're like that person yelling, "One more rep!" But you're not going to be there throughout their fitness journey because your job is simply to give them a head start so they can do the rest. That's similar to what an AI trainer does, but without the sweatbands. Just like how a gym coach teaches how to make better decisions and avoid bad habits, AI trainers focus on teaching AI how to interact more naturally and meaningfully. There are no squats or cardio exercises here because the role of an AI trainer is to work with data sets, teaching AI to recognize patterns and what kind of outcomes are fair and safe. If you're an AI trainer, you also teach AI how to learn from feedback by correcting it when it messes up. You already know that AI is the fastest growing technology, with different companies adopting its benefits, but right now it's more about getting the responses right than understanding feelings. Essentially, AI is good at small talk, but bad at comforting you when your girlfriend just dumped you. However, AI will likely start feeling things like empathy and ethical reasoning because of AI training. So even if many say AI will soon replace every job we have today, that isn't necessarily true. That's because there still needs to be a bridge between the human and machine worlds to translate complicated human stuff like emotions. It's like teaching your dog to sit. That sounds easy, but try explaining to them why it's rude to jump on guests. That's the challenging part about being an AI trainer in the future.